My name is Dr. Rowland Illing. I'm the Director and Chief Medical Officer for Amazon Web Services Public Sector Healthcare International. So I'm responsible for healthcare outside the US on behalf of AWS. I'm an academic interventional radiologist by background and have a deep interest in both health equity and sustainability. So it's my absolute pleasure to be hosting the webinar today, focusing on sustainability, and specifically sustainability with regard to healthcare. And we have some excellent panelists joining us today. We have Dr. Diane Gordon, who's the Associate Professor from the University of Colorado. And she's also a pediatric anesthesiologist, anesthetist if you're in the UK, at the Children's Hospital of Colorado, and the chair of the Society of Pediatric Anesthesia Specialist Interest Group in Sustainability, which is super interesting. We also have Dr. Elizabeth Hansen. She's also an associate professor of pediatric anesthesia at the University of Washington and is based in the Seattle Children's Hospital. And Dr. Dan Lowe, who is a third pediatric anesthetist based in Seattle Children's Hospital, also an associate professor, but also chief medical officer of the technology company AdaptX. They'll be hearing more from later on. So what I'd like to do is to really dive into the topic of sustainability. It's a huge topic and it's getting more and more interest. I came back from the HIMSS meeting in Chicago very recently, where sustainability is getting more and more interest. And there are many reasons for this, both just on a general societal level and also some interesting mandates that are coming in, certainly across the US and more broadly around the world. And again, we're going to hear a little bit more about those now. So what I'd like to do is to really say welcome to the panelists. We've got a really interesting and deeply knowledgeable panel. And what I'd like to really highlight in this panel is the work that AdaptX is doing around sustainability, and in particular discuss something called Project Spruce Forest, which you'll be very interested in hearing about. So first of all, I'd like to pass over to the microphone to Diane, because sustainability is, a hugely important topic more broadly. Everyone should be interested in it. But it does remain fairly rare to have the sustainability and healthcare piece joined together. So my question is, why is it important to all of those working in healthcare? Why should we be interested in sustainability? And in particular, why is anesthesia singled out as part of this topic? And so what particular relevance should we be interested in when discussing anesthesia more broadly? So Diane, please, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pull up a slide to help illustrate a few points here. All right, so there we go. So why should we care about sustainability in general in healthcare and in anesthesia? So the shortest way to answer that is that by telling you that the US, as we probably all know, leads the world in per capita greenhouse gas emissions, and our overall emissions are second only to China. The US healthcare sector itself is actually responsible for about 10% of all US greenhouse gas emissions, which is a pretty large proportion. Most developed nations' healthcare system only accounts for 3 to 5% of their country's emissions, but ours are 10%. So not only does the US have a really significant greenhouse gas emission culpability, but US healthcare has an outsized role in those emissions as well. And US healthcare contributing 10% of our country's emissions means that we, as a sector, emit a huge amount of greenhouse gas equivalents. If the US healthcare sector itself were a country, we would actually rank 13th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions, which is ahead of the entire UK. On a more global level, the healthcare sector as on a global a global stage contributes 27% of all emissions. And so anesthesia has a role to play in those emissions. And fortunately or unfortunately for us, our emissions are easily tied to our specialty and they're very measurable. So people are starting to take notice, as Rowland mentioned. Last April, the US Department of Health and Human Services announced a voluntary climate pledge for hospitals and healthcare organizations who wanted to publicly make a pledge to reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030. Now, Liz and Dan and I, and many other physicians, understand the importance of anesthesia and its role in reducing overall emissions. But now a huge non-clinical audience also knows, because it's suggested in the pledge slides themselves. These are slides from the White House slide deck. They literally call out waste anesthesia gases there, as you can see, as one important aspect of reducing emissions and a suggestion for committed hospitals to address. So our tiny little corner of healthcare is responsible for a big enough component of an entire hospital's emissions to be mention worthy in a White House document. So that's a pretty strong call to action. And if that weren't enough, there's rumblings of future involvement of the Joint Commission, which is the main regulatory body for hospitals in the United States and internationally as well. And non-compliance with the Joint Commission rules is enough to shut your hospital doors by completely removing your major sources of funding. So they carry huge weight in terms of driving performance initiatives and getting people to do what they want. And they have proposed some rules about that were regarding sustainability and greenhouse gas emissions. And those rules that are being considered currently, they're not in place, but they're being considered. They include each hospital designating someone responsible for reducing the hospital's greenhouse gas emissions. And they would require that each hospital measure emissions in several categories, one of those 6 being waste anesthesia gas. So big and influential organizations are taking notice of what we're doing and why we need to be doing it. And the reason that they care about anesthesia is summarized here on this slide I borrowed from Liz, because Seattle Children's has actually tried to quantify as best they can the emissions from their hospital. And big agencies like Health and Human Services and the Joint Commission, with their 30,000-foot view, look at these sort of metrics. And if you look at this metric, all of these different categories of emissions for Seattle Children's Hospital and every hospital mention lots of large sectors like natural gas and commuting and HVAC. Anesthesia is the only medical or clinical specialty that's listed anywhere on that entire chart. So no one else's clinical process even makes it on the chart. And although we're 7% of emissions, that's an incredibly outsized proportion of emissions for one specialty in one hospital. So that's why we're in the spotlight, and that's why we have.
That's really interesting. Do you think how many anesthetists do you think are aware that they're actually contributing to this amount of carbon impact? Because when I saw this data, I was really amazed that it was the only clinical specialty that was called out. When you talk about this to other anesthesiologists, what reaction do you get?
Depends how old they are. I would say people of about, my generation, my depth of training, are somewhat aware. The younger trainees coming out are far more aware, and the people who are nearing retirement have absolutely no idea.
Fascinating.
So, yeah, overall, I would say maybe 10, 15% of the people I work with have a solid grasp on our emissions culpability. What do you think, Liz? Do you agree?
Yeah, I would say, this was not something I learned about in my training at all. There was no mention of this in the medical school curriculum or in my residency training in anesthesiology. So I really only learned about this when I saw this data from our sustainability manager at Seattle Children's, Colleen Grohl, who would put together this inventory of our emissions each year using practice green health metrics. And Diane, thanks for presenting this. Just as a point of clarification, the emissions that are on this pie chart are just from our inhaled anesthetics. And so the operating room itself also is responsible for a fairly large amount of emissions with our use of HVAC and electricity and many disposable and single-use items. But this 7% is coming from the inhaled anesthetics only. And I think, Diane, you're probably going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but that's, I think, what people don't necessarily know about. I think we all can see the amount of waste that we generate providing healthcare with so much disposable, materials and items that we have to use. And we see these giant trash bags at the end of an operating room case and a surgery. And we, know that most of that is going to be either sent to a landfill or incinerated. But we don't actually see the anesthesia gases going anywhere. They're invisible.
Exactly.
Perfect. So Diane, please. Carry on.
Sure. So actually, it's a perfect segue because the next thing I wanted to address is why inhaled anesthetics in particular are so bad. And so the reason that we care so much about inhaled anesthetics is because they are very potent greenhouse gases. They're far more potent than carbon dioxide. To get really nerdy for a second, global warming potential is the name of the metric that you use to measure how well a gas traps heat in the atmosphere. So we can compare everything to carbon dioxide, which has a value of 1. And just as a point of reference, methane is 35 times as potent as carbon dioxide. Its global warming potential is 35. I've listed a few of our, the main anesthetic drugs there on this chart. We have sevoflurane is the name of the gas that we use that is the least detrimental to the atmosphere, and it is 130 times as potent as carbon dioxide. We have another option, isoflurane, which is 500 times as potent, and then we have our most harmful agent called desflurane, which is 2,500 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So this is why volatile anesthetics are a target. And, most people, anesthesiologists included, don't bandy about talking about global warming potential. So I've converted this into a little bit easier to digest idea. So if we run an hour of anesthesia at an appropriate depth for surgery, for just 1 hour with sevoflurane, it would be equivalent to driving a car 4 miles. And isoflurane is equivalent to driving the car 7 miles. But desflurane, that third gas I mentioned, an hour of anesthesia with desflurane is equivalent to driving a car 189 miles. So we're really talking about an almost 50-fold difference in environmental impact if we choose to use that gas instead of a different one. So there's really no clinical reason to choose desflurane over the other agents. And so part of our education is about these kind of differences between agents and trying to influence choices that people make. But there's a second component of that. And that is that regardless of which inhaled agent we choose, our anesthetic gases escape into the environment. And anesthetic gas, as some people may or may not know, it's not actually metabolized to any significant extent in the body. So what's breathed in is eventually breathed out. And most of the gas that's breathed out is carried away by the anesthesia machine out of the hospital, and it goes out an exhaust vent on the roof. Anesthetic gases aren't captured or reused, and their release into the environment isn't regulated in any way. So when these gases escape into the atmosphere, they have an outsized role in contributing to global warming, as we mentioned. So the first imperative that we have is to really educate our colleagues about the environmental impact of different gases and really advocate for using the least detrimental gases. So
I think that's really interesting. A question from the audience is, does the flow rate of the anesthetic gas impact the miles driven, which I'm assuming it does?
Yes, absolutely. So that actually leads perfectly into my next educational imperative. So bear with me for a quick second while I teach you a little bit about how anesthesia gas is delivered. So this little graphic I made shows low fresh gas flow in the upper left corner there. The gas flow comes into the anesthesia machine. It goes through the mechanism that delivers the gas, and then it delivers it to the patient. And then as the patient breathes out, gas can go back around through the anesthesia machine back to the patient or be sent out the scavenger to the roof. With low fresh gas flow, most of the exhaled anesthetic gas turns in the anesthesia machine, like that arrow shows, and goes back to the patient. And it goes around and around in a circle if we're using low fresh gas flow. And that means we're not using very much new gas from the vaporizer, and our emissions are much lower. We can contrast this with the next slide, which is high fresh gas flow. So I added a whole bunch more pink dots of anesthesia agent because with high fresh gas flow, the increased amount of gas that's going through the vaporizer is picking up lots and lots of extra gas. And a lot of that isn't actually making it into the patient. If you notice from the prior slide and this slide, there's still the same amount of gas in the patient. And that's because however much the person's breathing determines how much they take up. So the high flow just means that there's extra gas going through the circuit around, but not making it back into the inspiratory part of the circuit. It's going through the anesthesia machine, not making that turn, and it's going out the scavenger to the roof. So if we're the miles driven graphic that I showed assumes we're running 1 liter fresh gas flow for those anesthesia folks out there. That's considered low flow by kind of informal metric means, but it's pretty common for people to run 2 or 5 or more liters of fresh gas flow. And so those miles driven get multiplied by whatever the flow rate is. So that was kind of a best case scenario that I was showing you there. So that's really the main things that I kind of wanted to get across. First, that our first imperative is to teach people about that it matters which anesthetic gas they choose. And the second imperative is to try to work on their habits, because choosing low fresh gas flow is one of many, many small decisions that an anesthesiologist is making at the beginning and during the case while someone is asleep. And it's certainly not the most important thing that we're paying attention to, but it's something that we can teach people to work into their habits. And so trying to change the culture of a place and trying to change people's habits is really our second imperative. And that's a really difficult thing to do. All sustainability work struggles with the fact that you often can't make people care. But if you can build things into their workflow to help them do things the way that is least detrimental to the environment, you're going to be more successful than if you try to just change their heart. So we try to do education and changing of culture.
I think that's very true. I think mechanisms are the key, isn't it? Best intentions don't work. You've actually got to build things that people then follow. 2 interesting questions from the audience. So one is how low can you go when it comes to flow? That's right. And then the other thing is ultra low flow anesthesia and closed loop control features that are coming on board from the new anesthetic machines. Are they? I'm assuming they're things that you're thinking about and being introduced as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some technology advances that are coming. There's some newer anesthesia machines that have some pretty sophisticated reflector software in them that allow you to run really, really low flows. So to the commercial sector is also working on this, trying to make things that are appealing to people who are trying to be as minimally environmentally detrimental as possible. And the question about how low can you go really depends on how large your patient is and some of the specifics about the anesthesia machine, about where some of the ports send gas to. If they send the gas back into the machine, then you can run quite low flows. For an adult, I would say the low end is probably 0.5 to 0.7 liters per minute. If you're in ideal circumstances, but it really depends on what machine you're using and how long of a case you have to play with it. In a short case, you don't have as much time to achieve a state where you can run really, really low flows.
Got it. I think that's really good advice. But I think what I'd like to do now is actually, on the subject of mechanizing things and actually getting things set up and established as a practice, I'd actually like to pass over to Liz and really talk about what your institution's approach was to doing this. So now you know the risks about anesthetic gases. how do you go about actually mechanizing it and actually putting it into practice so that people follow it? And then how do you get other people on board to also buy into it and become part of a community? Because a lot of this is around community building and raising awareness. So please talk
Yeah,
about some
absolutely.
really tangible data, because I think that's what people want to hear, is about
Right.
tangible things that they can take away.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks, Diane, for setting up the stage and the background so beautifully. I've been at Seattle Children's Hospital for 7 years now, and I think being at a place that really prioritizes sustainability has been extremely important to the development of this work. I mentioned that we had a sustainability manager who showed me this data. We have now a sustainability director. We have really high level support for this kind of work, and we've been recognized as a climate champion numerous years in a row. We have a campus-wide goal to go carbon neutral by 2025. So I feel very supported by the institution to do this work, and I think that is a really helpful part of all of this. And so when I first learned about the impact of anesthesia gases from Colleen Grohl, I wanted her to talk to our entire department, and I started to really just look into the data and see, I learned all of what Diane showed us. And we kind of began this project really organically. And now looking back over the last 5.5 years of this work, we've broken down kind of the framework of what we did into these different categories. And so initially it really was a lot of socialization and education, and just really understanding the impact of the anesthesia gases that we used, the strategies that can be employed to reduce our flows safely and effectively, starting to build it into the curriculum for our anesthesia residents and fellows that come through our operating rooms. So now we have those lectures that are available to them, and giving formal presentations to the department so that they all could, everyone could have a chance to learn all of the things that Diane just explained. And I mentioned the hospital-wide climate pledges and initiatives, and just that is, a bit of kind of building pressure and support for this kind of work, that this is important. This is something that is coming from our leadership, as well as from those of us who are doing the direct clinical work. And adding some clinical decision support tools. So Diane mentioned, how depending on the case, there might be other areas of focus. You might be doing other things, caring for the patient, and not realize that your flows are at 8 liters per minute. And so having a small reminder on your electronic medical record to turn your flows down, if that's the case, can be very helpful. So we implemented that as well. So those are all about kind of changing, the culture, building some education pieces into this, and getting people to think about it. And then we moved into some of the other things that were already mentioned, some of these kind of changes to how we practice that make it easier to do the right thing. So some of those are practice constraints, like removing the desflurane vaporizers. So we initially started out with just taking them out of the operating rooms and putting them into the workrooms, so that if people felt like they had really no other alternative but to use desflurane, they could get it. But we just made it a little harder, so that the default was to not use it. And that persisted for a couple of years, and we regrouped and talked about it again, built consensus around the decision to actually just stop buying it. And so we actually removed it from our formulary pretty recently, but that was after a period of time of not really using it much at all. And then another thing that Diane mentioned is some of the anesthesia machines have become really sophisticated, but there are, even in most of these machines, some pretty simple fixes that can reduce the amount of fresh gas flow that we use by just changing the default. So our machines used to come on, you'd press the start button and it would turn on at 8 liters per minute. And that's a lot. It's not really usually very necessary to have that much flow. And it can be really wasteful, especially if you forget to turn the flows down after you've gotten started. And so we just had our techs come in and reprogram all of our machines so that they came on at 3 liters a minute. And that doesn't mean that you can't change it if you think you need more or less. But it just changed the default so that, that's where we started from. And that was a really helpful practice move, to just get people, to start at a lower amount of flow, and without, really being overly directive, because people can still change it. And that got us really talking about low flow inductions and strategies of how we could change our clinical practice. And people started realizing, oh, this is actually totally doable, and sharing, ideas and strategies for providing really excellent care with these kind of new parameters. And then Diane had it on her slide, but didn't specifically, I don't think, call out the global warming potential for nitrous oxide, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. It's in a little bit different category than our other inhaled anesthetics. It has over 100 years of about 300 times that of carbon dioxide. It actually persists in the environment for more than 100 years, and it's an ozone depleter. So it's a particularly harmful gas that we use, and we tend to use it in pretty high concentrations. So it's not uncommon to administer it at 50% or 70%, whereas our other anesthesia gases we're administering at 1, 3, maybe even 6%, but much, much lower percentages. So the impact of nitrous oxide is really quite massive. And when I was in training, it was a very common kind of default to just use some nitrous oxide at the beginning of every case, because it just seemed to make the going to sleep process for our pediatric patients, a little bit easier and smoother. And so it was the default. But once we talked about the just really outsized impact that it has on our emissions, we started to try not using it as the default and reserving it for the patients who really needed that extra help with, their induction of anesthesia, which turned out to be not very many patients. And so our group has really, over the years, pretty much moved away from routine use of nitrous oxide. At our ambulatory surgery center, we actually went around and unplugged all the nitrous oxide hoses from the wall, kind of like the desflurane vaporizers, just making it a little bit harder to use. You have to really make an intentional decision that you're going to use it to plug it back in and turn it on. So that really changed our practice as well. And then TIVA stands for total intravenous anesthesia. And there are a number of medications that we can use to keep patients asleep during surgery that go through the IV that are not greenhouse gases. Some of them have their own, environmental footprints, but none of them are as large as the inhaled gases that we use, and can be a really actually great alternative to inhaled anesthetics. And so we've started to really incorporate more use of TIVA in our practice. And then I think what really people are probably excited about to hear in this webinar is the data feedback part of things. And that came with the launch of Project SPRUCE, which stands for Saving Our Planet by Reducing Carbon Emissions. And we were able to take the global warming potential for each of the gases that we use and calculate using, published methods, turning the what we use and what we're calculating or what we're measuring in the electronic medical record. So all of the gases that we've used in our fresh gas flows are recorded in the EMR, and those get pulled into AdaptX. We calculate over into carbon dioxide equivalents in kilograms per minute averaged over the case. And that allows us to really see, where are we doing well? Where are our emissions low compared to before? Where are we still struggling? Who may be doing a really great job at reducing their emissions and who may still need some help. And then we were able to share that with our department and say, here are the people who have worked really hard to reduce their emissions. Way to go. If you want to know how they did it, you can ask them. Here are some tips. So that really revolutionized how we have tackled this, and I think has been really great for motivation and for morale in the group, because people have seen how far we've come with all of the work that we've done over the last 5 years. And then we've been able to see, where we still have work to do. And it's generated a lot of creativity in how, maybe people thinking outside the box, how we can reduce our emissions further. So
fascinating. Well, I think you touched on data then for a second. I'm really curious to know how you've got data for all of this, because that's the thing that, in my experience, the thing that drives change the best is actually showing people tangible data. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's, Dan, feel free to jump in at any time, but I remember talking about this with Dan and having this idea, we need some sort of, competition, a leaderboard, how can we can give like awards and badges and prizes to the people who've made the, most reductions in their emissions. And Dan's like, well, we could just put it in AdaptX. And so, Dan, why don't you tell people?
Sure. There's one thing about, so I'm just going to throw up a chart. This is from AdaptX. This is what Liz was talking about. You can take that raw data coming out of your anesthesia machines, what flow you have, how much gas you're using, and then you can basically convert it to, a CO2 equivalent. And you can see here at Seattle Children's, a few years ago, this is 0.3 kilograms generated per minute per anesthetic. So, 10 minutes would be 3 kilograms of CO2. You can visualize that, right? Where we are now is at 0.03. So that's a 10x reduction in a relatively short space of time. Now, that's just the headline rate. To get below that, you have to say, so AdaptX is able to stratify that down to, well, what types of patients were these? I know that's one of the questions in this chat. Is it big patients or small patients, or big surgeries or small surgeries, like different types of surgery? But more importantly, the physician community has a thread of, competitiveness in it, right? And tapping into that. You can put all 70 anesthesiologists in this chart and you can see, well, where do they fall? Are you helping this or are you hurting this? And that we thought it would have an effect of making everyone pay attention, but it just made everyone super competitive. It's like, well, I don't want to be as dirty as that person. I want a cleaner practice. I want a greener practice. And that really drove it down. We thought we were doing well when we got
I'm guessing you'll see a normal distribution across the entire group, and how you get that shift to the right of the normal distribution is really critical. If you can get that and understand where you lie on the normal distribution, that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah. So there was a few superstars who were like, 2 standard deviations away, and it's like, and they were like, and then Liz would publicly call them out and say, well done, and everyone's like hitting them up in the coffee room and saying, how do you do that? And it's that kind of like, you're going to win this battle one mind at a time. You have to, at the end of the day, you have to, what we're talking about, you have to change how you're taking care of patients. You have to change your habits you might have ingrained. So, I've been at Seattle Children's 12 years. And I, this was new to me about 3 years ago. I had no idea. And so everyone's got their personal dot. How do I fall in this? And that's been really remarkable to witness. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think I cut the slide out. I apologize. Yeah. I can try to share my screen of that what you're describing. Every anesthesiologist, CRNA fellow resident has their own dot. So it's basically taking the average from what you're seeing on this screen and showing it in that distribution that you're talking about, Rowland. So initially in the first phase, our baseline phase, it was a pretty normal distribution. Everyone was kind of spread out, because people didn't know. And then as we started to implement these interventions, you can see it tightening up. And, the people who respond to various things, to the education, there's a big drop in a big chunk of people. All they needed was to know, okay, this is a problem, I have to do something about it. And they had a big reduction. And then, some of the practice constraints came along, and that again forced some of the high emitters down. And then now that we're in this, kind of new steady state where we have the data feedback, we have all of these interventions, practice constraints, education that's ongoing, it's really a tight distribution. Thank you. You can see, what I'm talking about. So anesthesiologist B is someone who was an incredibly high emitter. And once they started to learn about it, had a massive drop in their emissions, was still high emissions until some of the practice constraints. I think was someone who liked to use desflurane. And then once that was harder to use, they became, average or below average. Anesthesiologist A.
That's a beautiful change management graph. If anesthesiologists around the world could look at that and go, wow, that's really interesting to how we move practice at a large scale and really make a difference. This is a great example.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me, like that there are, even the people who weren't really responding to education or anything else, once we, implemented some of the default fresh gas flow change, their emissions cut in half, even though they said publicly, I don't care about this. That was one person. Everyone else you can see, I mean, really has done an incredible job reducing their emissions. And that's how now we have such a low average, because all of these various interventions and people, really doing the work has made a big impact. And we have the same kinds of graphs for surgical type, patient age, duration of case, things like that. And so we've been able to really identify the areas where we've struggled. So one example in pediatric anesthesiology is otolaryngology cases. So ear tubes and tonsillectomies, they're short cases. We're often holding a mask with our fresh gas flow over the patient's face. And so it's really hard to get low flows in that kind of case. And so those are higher emissions, but we've been able to reduce them dramatically. They're just still the higher, ones. And then smaller patients, little babies, when we're not doing IV inductions, we're using the mask for them to go to sleep. So those have higher emissions on average. Dan, I mean, you've looked at this data as much as I have.
Yeah, I mean, the other remarkable thing, Rowland, is, and for the audience as well, you can quantify the variation. You can see the spread in practice patterns. And now, if you look now, the spread is really tight. I mean, people are very consistent. There's not much difference between people. Sometimes I know, Liz, you get disheartened because anesthesiologist A is your pet project and he just won't move, right? But if you think about this guy, and Diane is one of the ones that you were hinting at, approaching retirement and says that climate change isn't real, I'm not going to change. But if you take this guy who's an outlier and you took him back in time, I'm going to move my mouse back. If you took him back 4 years, you would have held him up to be one of the best people. Right, so now the worst performer would have been the best person. I mean, that's how far the needle's moved. So remarkable and great work. I'll stop sharing my screen. Let you have your slide.
That's really interesting. So I guess my next question is: so this is at one institution, and this is the showing the journey. So how do you then make it bigger than just your institution? How do you scale this?
That's a great question. So I mean, we have taken this on the road. Diane and I have presented this at national meetings, and we have started a consortium called Project Spruce Forest. So the goal for participating institutions is to reduce their emissions by 50% over 12 months by using these evidence-based methods with implementation science and data feedback with AdaptX. We reduced our emissions by 87% at Seattle Children's. So we think 50% is really doable for all of these participating organizations. And we have a number of institutions already on board for phase 1. We're recruiting for phase 2. This will take you to our website, projectspruceforest.com, or you can just Google it. And email Diane or me for more information. But yeah, it's really exciting because, the important thing that we need everyone to do this. It's great for our institutions to do it. There's a champion at, with Diane at her institution, me and Dan where I am, and there are people like us at all of these hospitals and departments that really care about this and feel really, passionately that this is something that we need to do something about. But without these kinds of tools, to really, bring it to everyone else in the department, it's really hard to make these kinds of big moves. And so having this framework, I think, is really helpful.
And on that subject of tools, I guess that's the key, is that how do you extract the data? And that's one of the questions in the chat, which is how do you extract this information? How do you surface it? What's the process? So, I mean, Dan, and this is a technology question to you, really. How's that? How are you doing? How are you going about this? What does it look like?
Yeah, so this is why it's one of the reasons why AdaptX was founded. When I came here from England in 2010, hospitals were still 50-50 on paper and just beginning their transition to digitize electronic medical records. Come 2014-15, most hospitals had completed that transition, and the OR was the last place to do that because of the dynamic kind of like workflow that you have there. You're doing surgery and you have to touch a computer, but they figured that out. That's great. Now the challenge is, how do you turn that, what we term real world data, that's data that's a byproduct of giving routine care. How do you turn that data that is generated at an ever increasing volume? How do you actually make it useful? And that's what AdaptX does. So we're able to take a data extract from any EMR. We work with Epic hospitals, we work with Cerner hospitals, of any size, and we're able to feed that into AdaptX. And then from that, we have a self-service solution that allows any clinician like Liz and Diane, or any of the clinicians, in fact, can look up, use that data to look across patients. Looks like Rowland's jumped out and jumped back in. Oh, you're back. Yeah, so the technology is one piece. That was only possible. So there's a few pieces of the jigsaw to make that happen. Very grateful to AWS and the cloud. I mean, if folks who are listening in don't understand how important the cloud is, every modern business puts its data in the cloud. They don't run it off a server under someone's desk anymore, because you can't do cool stuff with it if it's locked in a server somewhere. under lock and key. So if your healthcare system is not in the cloud already, most are, they should be not walking, they should be sprinting to the cloud, because then you can run cool applications like AdaptX off it, and you can actually change the vector of how we practice medicine like we've changed it. That's a dramatic change. Liz and Diane, you managed to turn 100 years of established practice and turn it on its head in just a year or two. I mean, that's the pace of change that's possible. Now you can learn. Liz, you were saying, when you learn, just like same as Diane and me, it was like everyone's taught to turn on 4 liters of nitrous. That's what you did, right? And now we can actually question, well, if I don't do that, what happens? And the answer is not very much, like nothing. But now we're able to see that. So our pace of change is about to accelerate because of.
And I think it's the ability to extract, as you say, real world data in real time. Because I think both of those components are really important, because you need to see the change that you're having. Actually, it's not a 6 months later you can download a spreadsheet and then maybe have data scientists and do some number crunching.
Yes.
This is actually real world, real time. So how do you do that?
Yeah, so AdaptX takes a daily data feed. So the patients you take care of today will be in your system tomorrow. So if you make a change as an individual in your practice today, you want, I talk about an action review. Do something, did it work? Well, rather than going do something, I feel like it's good, you can see it, right? So it's a little bit like riding a Peloton, right? If a Peloton would not be the business it was in, it is, if it didn't give you a score at the end of your ride. So AdaptX, think of AdaptX as the Peloton score for your clinical practice, right? Not just for you, but for your group. How did your group do on your group ride today, right? Are you moving together? And we practice in silos. So having that data in a system and a platform that supports and allows you to, look at it yourself, self-service, without going through a bureaucratic, process to get the data. It should be as fast as a Google search, and that's what it is. None of, yeah.
And do you need to be technical to be able to do this? I'm sure there'll be anesthetists and anesthesiologists listening to this talk going, I really like it, but I'm not that technical. How is it accessible?
Yeah, so it's been engineered to the level of Airbnb. So the way I think about it is, when we built AdaptX, we said, hey, have you ever been on vacation? Yes. Have you ever used Airbnb? Yes. Did you need to go on training to book your first vacation house? No. So the level of competence, if you can use a smartphone, send a text, and book a vacation house, you can use AdaptX. That's the level of sophistication.
Fascinating. So a question from Ian Hughes from Rush, which is, how are you extracting the flow rates consumption data from the vaporizers? How does that actually work?
Oh, so in your backend, so thanks for the question from Rush. Your EMR system is actually capturing, if you have a full anesthesia AIM system, it'll be every minute it captures your gas flow for oxygen, for nitrous, for air, and every minute it will, at least you can see on your gas analyzer, your inspired concentration of sevoflurane, desflurane, or isoflurane. So a combination of those numbers lets you calculate for that minute of the case, how much CO2 did you generate? So then if it was a 2-hour case, we know we can summate, especially integrating under error and recurve, we can summate what you produce for that case. And then because you know how long the case took, you can come up with a CO2 per minute for that case. But that data is there. You can see it on a monitor, and it's been piped back to Epic in Wisconsin, or piped back to Kansas City in Cerner.
Fascinating. And another question, which is the data back compatible with Epic EMR? I guess any EMR can actually go back into the system as well as being taken out of it.
Yeah. So what we've does it? I think. Sorry, did I understand the question correctly?
Yeah. So once you have these data which are being presented here, can that actually be put back into the EMR? So will a patient get their own anesthetic score at the end?
Yeah, no. So we don't have that capability. We don't write back into the EMR. We take that raw data, the real world data, and we compute something. So the graph that Liz just showed is CO2 equivalent, right? So here, this is a theoretical construct. CO2 equivalent. You can't see it. You can't measure it. You can't hold it in your hand. This is an equivalent. It's a construct. But it's amazing when you show people, hey, you use this much flow, this much gas, and you use this much desflow in your flow, and this is what you're producing. They will start changing their practice, and they manage this number to this theoretical construct, but it has real world consequences. And the real world consequence, when you're trying to persuade your hospital leadership to do this, if they don't buy into, let's do it for the right thing, speak their language. Go to the C-suite and say, would you like to spend $175,000 less this year than we did a couple of years ago? And very few C-suites will say, okay, that's getting on for 200. Yeah, I would love to do that. How do I do that? And so you have to make a business sense. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. Now, the great thing that Liz and Diane has managed to do is they have basically threaded the needle. You can win financially. You can win clinically. You can actually give great clinical care, and you can win by giving us reducing your environmental impact. The three things are not incompatible. In fact, they're so compatible. They're three sides of a three-sided dice.
That's very elegant. And again, another question coming from Rush, which is, are children's hospitals able to participate if they don't have a standalone building from an adult hospital? Do you need to be a separate building, or can you be part of a larger institution?
No, you can be part of a larger institution if your pediatric group can kind of do this independently. So you don't have to be in your own separate building, but if you have your own separate group that's pediatric anesthesiologists, where we can kind of focus specifically on this. Diane and I are pediatric anesthesiologists. This is, I think, an area where we can have a much bigger difference because we're doing that inhalation induction. We're using more nitrous oxide. So we focused initially here. Eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to, expand this beyond just pediatric groups.
That was going to be my next question. It's like this: you're saving all the good stuff just for the pediatrics, and this is something that should be adopted more broadly, surely.
Absolutely, and that's the goal long term.
Yeah, we took the Amazon, since we partnered with an AWS partner, we took the Amazon approach of working backwards. Like, how do you make this happen? And start with something small, agile, and tangible, worked within our network. So we've got 8 hospitals participating in wave 1. We're lining up wave 2. So if you want to, it's not too late to get in. So drop us an email and we can get you in. So Zachary from Rush, if Rush wants to get in, drop us an email and we'll get you in. And then once we've proven a point in Rush at the Children's Center, it'll just be a hop, skip, and a jump to make all the adult practice folks. I mean, it's right there. So how do we get in with a tight enough group? And we start in peds because look, the 3 of us are all pediatrics, and so we start there. But every pediatric hospital has a sister adult hospital, so or an affiliated one. So that's where we started.
And also, you've been focusing, by the sounds of it, in the US at the moment. My interest is outside the US as well as in the US. So are you looking for institutions that are outside the US as part of your phase 2?
Yeah, well, because AdaptX is a cloud-based solution, runs this application that runs on the cloud. AWS actually has data centers all over the world. So for example, we're working with a children's hospital in British Columbia. We're also working with a children's hospital in Sydney, Australia. There are local rules and governance about where data can go, but that's fine. So the Australians said, that's fine, we'll do this, but it has to stay within our physical borders. But you happen to have an AWS data center in Sydney, so it's fine.
and I think that is part of the benefit, the beauty of the cloud, which I think can't be underestimated, which is the democratization of access to these kind of solutions. You really can deploy them around the world as easy as turning on a light switch. And I think if you can deploy this kind of solution in all of the anesthetic rooms around the world, imagine the savings there'd be in terms of impact on greenhouse gases. It'd be phenomenal. And obviously individual savings for institutions about wastage of gases. That's quite remarkable. Very good. 2 other questions have come in on the chat in terms of a very interesting, maybe contentious question, which is, do you find differences in behavioral modification amongst the different groups of residents, anesthesiologists, or CRNAs? So who are the easiest to get to adapt when they see their own data? Or is that just too much of a leading question?
I mean, I haven't seen a huge difference. I think each group has their, really enthusiastic early adopters that are influencing the rest of the group, and a few of those that are lagging behind. So, I have to say we've partnered with one of our CRNAs who has done an amazing job, really advocating for this work and has moved, the entire group along, and they tend to be competitive with each other. So that really works in our favor. The residents we have rotating through every 3 months. So, I give them a lecture when they first start and kind of introduce them to all of this. And so they are starting fresh, learning about this sometimes for the very first time. And coming in, but they're really influenced by each attending that they work with every day. And so I think that they are getting a lot of different, information all at once. And it's one of many things that they're learning about pediatric anesthesiology, but I think they're very interested in it, and they're of, the generation that has grown up with climate change, and this is on their minds. They care about it.
Perfect. I'm hugely fascinated by this topic, and I'm really excited by this real data that you're presenting that changes practice and has a real impact. So I'm hugely supportive of this work that's being done. I think as we're kind of coming into the end of this discussion, I'd be very interested to think about your takeaways. Having done this whole process and been through it and lived it, what would be your takeaways that you'd leave the audience with about what they should do or how they should consider approaching this topic or other similar ones? Because again, once you're building this once you have a tool that can extract data, so AdaptX isn't just a sustainability tool, it's also a multi-purpose tool that can extract lots of other interesting different bits of data. What takeaways would you give to all of those listening today about their practice, how they would approach it? Maybe we'll start from the top. Maybe Diane.
I would say, high level, the country, as a country, we spent $40 billion standing up EMRs. Let's use the data. We have got past the wedding, which was like, get it stood up and start entering data. We've done that. Now, over the next 5 years, 2 years, 1 year, right from today, there's nothing stopping us. Use the data. What we've seen AdaptX do is how folks have used it. I mean, we haven't talked about clinical effectiveness. Like, how do I know what drugs work, what drugs don't work? That data's there now. All these natural experiments have already happened. Where Liz and I practice, for example, we've become the first opioid-free surgery center in the world. Like, we've managed to not just eliminate desperin, we eliminated fentanyl and morphine, and the kids are doing better than ever. So that's another aspect. So environmental impacts, clinical effectiveness, operational efficiency. So they're all facets that you can use. And it just so happens that's what every hospital system wants to do. They want to give better care. They want to give more efficient care. They want to do more work in less time. They want to do more with less, and they want to damage the planet less. So the data that you're already capturing, if you just democratize it, unleash it, stick it in the cloud, run cool applications like AdaptX on it, you can do all this stuff now.
Perfect. Good. Diane, where would you go now? Where would you go if you're starting out?
Well, I think for me, it depends who I'm trying to help. So if you're a clinical person listening in, if you're an anesthesiologist, think about something that you're passionate about and something that you can get baseline data for. Because if you want to affect change, you really need to be able to show that change. So you need data, and you need to pursue something that matters to you. So those, for clinical folks, I think that's really important. And for administrative, C-suite and administrative type folks, I think what's really important is to try to establish that culture of sustainability from the top down, but also look for a clinical champion who can help run it from the anesthesia side, because you really need somebody on the inside, so to speak, to help look for the low-hanging fruit, find what would be a good way to go for it. But we all love upper level support. It makes everything so much easier. So if you are an upper level person, by all means, start sifting through your clinical people and find somebody to take it on as a clinical champion, and then you guys will be unstoppable.
Perfect. Liz.
Oh, I love both of what you guys just both said. I agree with Diane 100%, and I think that as a clinical person, we sometimes feel like we have all these rules and policies that we have to follow, and some of them are not always in agreement with what we think is, the most sustainable way to go forward. And so it can feel like we don't have the ability to really do this work. But I think that really trusting our clinical judgment, our expertise, and our position as, physicians, this is something that actually is impacting health. The climate crisis solution that we are responsible for as, delivery of healthcare is impacting patients already. We're seeing, that children are getting sicker, that people are climate refugees, and that's impacting their health. I mean, this is already a public health, worldwide problem. And so we have a responsibility to do something about it and to change the way we practice so that we're at least reducing the harm that we're causing.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, I took away from this talk that there is a real imperative now, not just around the climate, as you're saying, and just the global crisis we're facing, but also actually a strategic imperative by healthcare organizations, especially the Joint Commission, coming regulations. I think that's going to be a big financial, incentive to make sure that sustainability is built in and organizations are sustainable by design, as you said. I think, as you said, with regards just to anesthesia, adapting technique, reducing fresh gas flows, these simple things can have a real impact if you measure them and if you can demonstrate what those metrics actually are. And again, I think that then leads on to that piece about what, you can only influence what you can measure. And there are tools available now that allow you to do that. And it goes beyond just sustainability. So I think with tools such as AdaptX, again, if you can democratize access to them, access these tools around the world, you can really use them at the point of need. And that's the exciting thing. And again, I think cloud has a lot to offer in that regard. I think, again, we haven't touched upon cloud more broadly about, it's just more efficient to run large amounts of computing in cloud rather than in people's own data centers. We've done a lot of work that shows it's 88% more efficient to run computing in the cloud than in data centers on premises. And so I think that alone will also reduce institutions' greenhouse gas footprints going forward. And there are lots of areas where we can think about. There's a whole inventory supply chain piece, there are buildings, infrastructure, as well as clinical care delivery. So I think there's lots of opportunity here that we can dive into and really understand it better. So anyway, in summary, I'd like to thank my three panelists who've joined us today. We had some really interesting questions arising from the audience, and we answered them as we went along. And I hope you all have a chance to dive in deeper. As I said, we're doing Project Spruce Forest Phase 2 is open now. And if any organizations are interested in joining, I'm sure the group here will be very happy to take it on, both Liz and Diane, and I'm sure they'll be very welcome for emails offline. So thank you once again for joining, and I'm sure you'll take this to heart and run with it in your institutions going forward. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.